In my early 50s, when I was rebuilding my life after the end of a long marriage, I'd gotten to the point where I felt emotionally flat, disconnected, and somewhat numb. Nothing was really exciting. It was hard to laugh. It was easier to be cynical. I knew what I didn't like, and I knew that I wanted peace, but what did I actually want? I wasn't even sure. And I found myself on a journey trying to figure out more things about myself, trying to uncover some of the blind spots I'd been missing. I realized I'd become very good at using logic and a strong work ethic to power through whatever I needed to do in life, but most of the time I found myself unfulfilled. I would convince myself that I should like something, that it was the best option, even if I was lying to myself. And as I was rebuilding my life, I happened to stumble across a blog post from 2015 that really resonated with me. Brian Reeves, a former military officer who spent 10 years numb and disconnected from himself, wrote an article called 5 Signs a Man is Connected to His Heart. And I'll read just the beginning here, and I'll link to it in the description. Many men think our power is in our brains or our balls. Our rational brains are supposed to do all the figuring out, while our testosterone-filled balls supply the driving force. Intelligence, determination, courage, sheer force of will. These are the masculine convictions of our brains and our balls, and they're absolutely valid and essential in their own way. But when used in isolation from our true power source for too long, they leave us dead inside, unable to deeply connect with life, including our intimate partners. Wow, that made sense to me. There was something inside of me that I was not connected to. And I think it's fair to say that many of us men were raised to be disconnected from ourselves. If you're an older guy like me, then you were raised in an era when boys were taught to suppress their emotions and act like they always had it together. And you can add on top of that the emotional trauma and people-pleasing that many of us grew up with, and certain careers where it's just dangerous to feel too much. And you've got the perfect storm for shutting down feeling much of anything except maybe anger. This is the core crisis of midlife masculinity. We become experts at emotional invulnerability. We confused emotional suppression with masculine strength. And that can be useful in short bursts to get through certain situations, but long-term, that invulnerability has a massive hidden cost. It breaks the essential systems we need to reinvent ourselves in a way where we can create meaningful lives that we're satisfied with. And it keeps us from connecting with others in a deep human way. You can't rebuild life after 40 and do it well if you can't hear your inner compass. And here's what I mean by that. Your emotions, your gut feelings, that sense of rightness or wrongness about something, these aren't just feelings, they're information. They're how you know what you actually want versus what you think you should want. And when you spent decades suppressing that system, you end up in a specific kind of trouble. You can make decisions, you can be productive, but you're operating with limited information. You're choosing based on what seems rational, what seems responsible, what you think you're supposed to want. But you've lost touch with what actually feels right. So you can become efficient with logic alone, but you often end up making decisions out of alignment with what's going to be a good fit for you long term. And this shows up in real ways. You stay in a career that pays well or has great benefits and looks good on paper, but you feel nothing when you wake up in the morning. No pull, no energy. You just know you're supposed to want it because it's stable and looks respectable. Or you're in a relationship that functions fine at the surface level. You can list all the reasons logically it makes sense, but there's this hollow feeling, like you're going through the motions without actually feeling connected. Or maybe you're trying to rebuild your life after a divorce or a career change, and when people ask you, what is it you want to do next? You have no idea. Not because you lack intelligence or options, but because when you look inward for that sense of what you're drawn toward, there's just nothing there. That's what happens when you disconnect from your emotional core for long enough, or were never connected to it to begin with. You don't lose your ability to function. You lose your ability to know what's worth functioning toward. And the really tricky part is that this disconnection doesn't feel like a crisis. You probably truly believe that you're making solid, rational decisions. You've learned to be practical, to think things through. And some of you might be thinking, but isn't being an adult about doing what you need to do, whether you feel like it or not? Yes, of course. There are responsibilities, but there's a difference between occasionally overriding your feelings for practical reasons. We all need to do that at times, and spending decades completely disconnected from them. There's a difference between choosing to do something you don't feel like doing and having no idea what you feel like doing in the first place. And I went through this myself. I could have told you all the logical reasons I made certain choices, but there was this persistent flatness that told me something was just wrong. I just couldn't articulate to myself what it was. And it wasn't until I started paying attention to that numbness, that emotional disconnection, that I began to understand what had happened. I had spent so long suppressing my emotional responses, overriding my gut, not trusting myself, that I had effectively disabled my internal navigation system. And the work of reconnecting to that became the foundation of everything else. Because until I could start accessing what I actually felt, what actually resonated with me, I was just going to keep making the same mistakes in different forms. This process took time. It wasn't easy. It did take work. And I had to learn to trust myself. If you're recognizing yourself in what I'm describing, if you're feeling that flatness, that sense that you're just going through the motions without really being present, I want you to know this is real. This isn't just you being cynical or tired. You might have become that way, but that's not the core problem. This is what happens when you spend too long cut off from your emotional core. And in working with men, I've learned that some are more receptive to this message than others. Some will misunderstand me and think I'm suggesting they need to start talking about or expressing their feelings all the time, essentially becoming someone they're absolutely not. That's not what this is. Every human benefits from being connected to their own feelings because they really are useful information for making decisions and also allow us to genuinely connect with others. This is the starting point. Recognition. Understanding that the flatness, the disconnection, the inability to know what you want, these aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of the same thing. You've been disconnected from your emotional core, and that's your primary source of direction. And once you recognize this, once you understand what's actually going on, you can start doing something about it. Not through force or willpower. It doesn't work that way. But by slowly starting to pay attention to those signals you've been overriding for years. If you want a more tactical video on how to do that, be sure to watch this one next. I made it more for people pleasers, and if that doesn't apply to you, you still might get something out of it though. And I'd appreciate it if you comment and let me know if you can relate to this issue. Please support the channel by liking the video if you got value from it, and consider subscribing, especially if you're a guy over 40 trying to rebuild a better second chapter. I hope you have a great day.